Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the vice president of the foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspectives on the burning issues of the day. And of course, one of those burning issues is the sanctions that President Obama is imposing on Russian officials in response to President Putin's invasion, occupation, annexation of Crimea, part of it, which was part of Ukraine. So, Sheldon, I thought we would talk about just sanctions in general, some different angles of sanctions. It's one of the favorite foreign policy tools now of the U.S. government. They've been using them for decades, and it goes all the way back to, the embargo against Cuba, which is still ongoing. One of the most ridiculous and destructive and brutal and nasty forms of sanctions I think that the U.S. has ever adopted. It's so vicious what they've done to the Cuban people in the hopes that they're still going to oust Fidel Castro from power and trying to retaliate for what happened at the Bay of Pigs still. And then you've got the sanctions against the Iranian people that is just squeezing the heck out of them. The middle class is decimated. They're the ones paying the biggest price for the sanctions against Iran. We had the sanctions against Iraq that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And then another one that I thought we'd talk about today, which I think was one of the original sanctions, and that was with respect to the sanctions against the Japanese, which was Roosevelt's objective to get the United States involved in World War II. So I'll throw it over to you, but I just thought we'd generally speak about sanctions again with a focus maybe on some of these different areas.
Yeah, certainly in the news, and it's going to be in the news more and more as we go along here. Actually, it goes back at least to Jefferson, if not earlier. Jefferson used it as president against France and England. He called it peaceful coercion. So that's not very far off from how the powers that be today regard sanctions. They see it as a way of hammering another country short of warfare. Of course, in terms of international law, it counts as warfare. Economic war is war. However, the American officials still like to think of it in Jeffersonian terms. It's peace coercion. They don't use that term, but they might as well. So the questions are, the question related to what's in the news today is, apart from whether it's justified or not, we can discuss that too, but whether it has any chance of working against Russia. And it seems hard to believe that it would. Russia is a big country with economic ties to Europe and China. It's not an easily isolatable country the way North Korea is. And it's not a situation like South Africa was, where basically the whole world was willing to put sanctions on South Africa because of apartheid. So it seems like this is an exercise in futility. There'll be much sound and fury. But it won't signify much. There'll be these tit-for-tat sanctions. But I have a hard time believing that the Russian oligarchs who are at the moment targeted with these sanctions won't find ways to move their money around. These days, that's easier to do than ever before. I read over the weekend that internationally Visa and MasterCard are not going to stop payments to Russia, so that's not going through. And Europe, which has close economic ties to Russia, I mean, the volume of trade with Russia, between Russia and Europe is 4 times what it is between the United States and Europe, something like, and Russia, something like 400 billion versus 40 billion. Europe is not excited about putting sanctions on Russia, so that really leaves the United States, and it's hard to believe just purely in terms of effectiveness whether it can work.
Well, and your point about this being an act of war is I think, a very, very valid point. And the thing about it is, if the sanctions continue to be tightened on Russia, there's just no telling where that could end up. I agree with you. I think they're going to be sort of just a slight message is going to be sent with maybe some mild sanctions, freezing bank accounts of people that don't even have bank accounts in the United States, restricting travel and so forth. But if they start tightening the noose, like they have with Iran, like they did with Iraq, there's just no telling what could happen on something like that. And that's why I mentioned the Pearl Harbor thing. Because here was an instance, and let's talk about it for a moment, that here was an instance where Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, really wanted to get into World War II. That, he was having a difficult time, though, persuading the American people. I forget what the numbers are, but like 90% of the American people were opposed to entering the war. And this was after war had broken out between Germany and England and France. The American people had seen what had happened in World War I, which was just a total disaster for the United States, well, and for Europe too. But I mean, that was going to be the war to end all wars and the war to make the world safe for democracy, and they were going to finally bring an end to European wars. And American men died for nothing. Absolutely nothing. And here was this philosophy of interventionism, and the American people had figured that out very quickly. It was a total waste. So when World War II breaks out, they wanted to have nothing to do with it. Roosevelt knew this, so when he's running for president in 41, he's there campaigning in 40 and so forth, telling Americans, I will keep your boys out of these foreign wars. And he has got that famous line, I've said it again and again, your boys are not going to be sent to die in foreign wars. Well, it was all a lie, that he was trying his best under the table to get involved in World War II. But the Germans weren't taking the bait. He kept throwing the bait out there in the Atlantic, hoping that the Germans would attack, and then he could say, "Oh, we've been attacked, and then get a declaration of war from Congress." And of course, this was when the presidents were still following the Constitution with respect to the declaration of war requirement from Congress. So he goes into the Pacific as a backdoor to war, hoping to squeeze the Japanese into attacking the United States. And then, of course, then Germany would come to the assistance of Japan under their treaty. And so how does he do that? He does this with sanctions, with an embargo on oil shipments, knowing that Japan was highly dependent on oil in its war in China, and imposing humiliating conditions and demanding that Japan exit out of China and Southeast Asia, and knowing that Japan would never go along with it. And then they did what they did here with Russia, and they've done with Iran and so forth. They froze bank accounts of Japanese officials. And of course, all of this leads Japan to say, well, this noose is tightening around us, we might as well go ahead and attack. And that's what they do at Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, we've got all the evidence that Roosevelt looked the other way, and that really this was what his objective was with these sanctions.
Well, that's right. And we know that from various officials. Secretary of War Stimson famously writes in his diary on the 25th of November, 1941, that the discussion was how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot. So that they're quite clear about what they're trying to do there. The danger with Russia is different, because I don't think the goal here is to maneuver Russia into firing the first shot. I don't think the objective is a shooting war with Russia. These are two nuclear powers, and I have a feeling the people on both sides are sane enough to know that that would not be a good idea. So I don't think that's what they're after. Russia's also in a very different position from what Japan was then. There's no way the U.S. could deprive Russia of oil. First of all, it has its own oil and gas. That's one of the reasons Europe is not too excited about putting sanctions on Russia. And I don't see how we could deprive Russia of scrap metal, which is another thing they deprived Japan of, backing them into a corner. So the U.S. certainly does not have the leverage that it had over Japan back then. But it does. We must keep in mind that when you pick a fight like this with a country like Russia, you can't be sure what the consequences will be. And I like to keep saying, and I've been saying throughout this crisis, nobody wanted World War I. None of the leaders wanted World War I. They all knew it would be a disaster, particularly the Kaiser and the Tsar. In fact, they were related. They were cousins. They were writing each other using affectionate nicknames with each other. And yet, once the mobilization begins to get started as a show of pride and strength, they couldn't pull back. And so it's like a juggernaut rolling down a hill. Whereas even if they were watching it go, thinking this is going to be terrible, and I think they did know that, there was nothing they could do about it once things were set in motion. So this is what worries me about the Russia-U.S. confrontation over Crimea and Ukraine. That you don't know where it can end up.
Well, yeah, and you know, I agree with you. I think the last thing they want is war with Russia and vice versa. But things could easily get out of control, and you've got two leaders that are very, very proud, and they're supported by a national security state apparatus in each country that is, you know, telling their respective president, we have to show toughness, we can't back down, and you can have unforeseen consequences of sanctions where one nation says, you know, we're not going to put up with this anymore. Look at they're squeezing this group of people here in Russia, and they maneuver some troops over into East Ukraine or whatever as a retaliation. Things get out of hand very, very quickly. And I think that when you look at these sanctions on other countries like Iraq and Iran, there you have a really total squeeze job here, where they've got a noose around the neck of the country and they're tightening it. But they know that militarily Iraq couldn't attack the United States. They know that Iran wouldn't dare start a retaliatory effort militarily. And so they can keep tightening this noose. What concerns me is with this arrogance of power, when they see themselves, what they're able to accomplish with Iran and decimating the middle class there, and what they did with Iraq, is that they get tempted through that arrogance of thinking, hey, we can squeeze here a little bit further. We can punish Putin. We can start decimating his middle class by this aspect of sanctions, you know, cutting off banking access to this sector of the economy, and you never know where that's going to lead.
Right, and the Iran issue is important because I think it's what gives a misconception about Iran, gives the American public, it lets the American public perhaps find it credible that sanctions could cause Russia to bend, to relent. And here's the myth. The myth is that these sanctions that have been put in on Iran over the last X number of years is what brought Iran to a willingness to talk to the P5+1 about its nuclear program, which has been going on over the last several months. But in fact, it's a myth. It's a myth, the McCain and other people like to repeat, that it took sanctions to get Iran to talk about this program, which is not, by the way, a weapons program, contrary to what they say. But because we know for a fact that Iran has been expressing a willingness to sit down and normalize relations with the United States and make sure that its civilian nuclear power program is transparent, just to make sure nobody's nervous about it. They've been repeatedly trying to talk to the U.S. about that for years. I mean, for sure back in 2003, but probably earlier than that. So it's just a myth that they didn't do this until there were biting sanctions. And so if people stop believing that it took sanctions to get around to the table, maybe they'll see that sanctions are not an effective, much less a legal and peaceful way to impose your will on a foreign government.
You know, and I think we need to raise the whole moral issue of sanctions as a weapon of foreign policy. They always start out with this notion that we're going to punish certain individuals within the government. For example, this latest set of sanctions against Russia that, the Secretary of Defense over there, or maybe some private oligarch, somebody that was involved with Ukraine, who knows? I do find kind of fascinating that they don't impose the sanctions on Putin. I mean, Putin is the guy who's responsible for all this. All the others are underlings following orders, but they exempt the guy who's actually the one that's responsible for this invasion of Crimea. But I think that ultimately these things started getting expanded, and the idea is to squeeze the middle class of that country in the hopes that group of people will then, there'll be an outcry among that group of people, or there'll be, a rebellion saying, hey, please succumb to whatever the United States is doing because we're getting crunched here. And so ultimately, the U.S. is using that group of people, many of whom may not even agree with the government. And they're using them as the pawns to try to secure what they want. We saw this especially in Iraq when you had probably one of the most brutal sets of sanctions ever in history, where they couldn't repair their water and sewage facilities that the Pentagon had destroyed during the Persian Gulf War. Children were dying of diseases, illness, infectious illnesses, dirty water, and so forth. And it was all justified. I mean, it was because, hey, we need regime change here. And there's that famous line by Madeleine Albright when 60 Minutes asked her, that here you've had 500,000 Iraqi children killed with these sanctions. Do you think it's worth it? And she said, well, yes, it's a difficult issue, but yes, it's worth it. And, what kind of morality, comes up with that kind of conclusion that the lives of innocent children are worth regime change? And yet we've become so accustomed to these sanctions that we don't stop to think about the human cost and the immorality of using this weapon against people that are innocent of what their government is doing. And the latest example is Iran, where people are just losing their entire life savings. They're having to sell things just to survive. And the whole middle class is getting decimated. And again, with the idea of, well, if we can cause enough misery among the Iranian people, they'll either overthrow the regime and put a U.S.-installed dictator in, like the Shah of Iran again and so forth, or they'll put enough pressure on the regime to give in. Well, most of these regimes are very proud. They're as proud as U.S. officials are, and they don't like to be perceived as giving in to this type of pressure.
No, that's right. And there's no evidence that these sanctions over the years have eroded the power of the Iranian Republican Guard, which is supposedly the feared, fierce element of the Iranian government and military that American officials worry so much about. There's no evidence that it's harmed them at all, but it has increased prices. It's deprived people of medicines, children of medicine, and it's wreaked havoc with the currency. And so you're right. There's a hardship imposed on the very large, educated Iranian middle class, which by all natural course of events ought to be close friends with the United States. I mean, the whole business is ridiculous. And like you say, what would Americans think, or even American rulers think, if sanctions were imposed on the United States in order to get the U.S. to do something that the government didn't want to do? I have a feeling most Americans wouldn't be saying to the government, do what they're asking, do what they're demanding, so we can get these sanctions off. I think they would be saying, let's get the Marines mobilized to send them into the country that's putting the sanctions on us. So it's a failure to once again, to look at how to check to see how American policy looks on the other end of it. They never do that. And as I wrote about on Friday in the TGIF column, it's what I call the American disease. I mean, given the long history of U.S. intervention and meddling in various kinds of ways, subtle, overt, covert, non-governmental organizations, National Endowment for Democracy, or CIA, however you cut it, the U.S. has been so meddlesome in foreign countries' affairs that any opposition is immediately tagged as being American, right? American-backed. Any domestic opposition can be stigmatized as being secret agents of American interests. That it fatally taints it. It infects it with this disease. And I think sanctions are going to be received the same way. Don't do something the Americans are demanding and imposing sanctions about, because that would be to cave in to the Americans. And why should we cave in to the Americans? We're Russians, we're Iranians, whatever the case. Why should we cave in? That's the same kind of reaction Americans would have if the tables were turned.
That's exactly right. Americans would say, we can put up with this suffering, don't give in to them, and we'll outlast them. Or as you say, let's go to war against them to put a stop to this. And you see this in Cuba. I mean, here this embargo has gone on for, 50 years now. And what oftentimes Americans forget is that these are not just sanctions on foreigners. This isn't just an infringement on the rights of foreigners to have economic liberty. This is an infringement on the rights of the American people as well. I mean, if they transact business, say these Russian officials transact business at an American bank, and the American bank says, we're not going to freeze anything, they're put in jail. They're fined by the Justice Department. And so nobody stops to think about, hey, what about the economic liberty, the economic rights of the American people? And you see this especially with respect to the Cuban embargo. That if you as an American, we like to think about, hey, this is embargo just on the Cuban people. It's an infringement on the rights of the American people. That if you travel to Cuba and you spend money there, when you get back, they're going to put you in jail. Imagine that. An American doesn't have the freedom to travel where he wants and spend his own money the way he wants because the government controls his economic activity. How is that any different from communism? How is that any different from socialism? I mean, here they purportedly object to Castro because he's established this socialist system, which is really just government control and government ownership over the means of production. But over here, they advocate a system of government control over what people do with their money and then putting them into jail for violating that. I mean, I think this is why we've got to examine this whole thing of sanctions, not just in terms of the misery that we impose, that our government imposes on foreigners, the death, the destruction, the economic impoverishment, the immorality in that, but it's also what they're doing to our freedom, our economic liberty, the right to do what we want with our own money, our right to travel wherever we want, trade with people we want, interact with people we want, freedom of association. I sometimes think that maybe the best place to start with this thing is lifting this Cuban embargo. 50 years, Sheldon. I mean, isn't that long enough to want regime change in Cuba? I mean, if you don't have a better evidence of failure than that, what is?
Well, the power to regulate trade with foreign nations, unfortunately, was assumed by the government in 1789, and it has been exercised relentlessly ever since. I mentioned Jefferson already, but there have been embargoes and use of trade as a tool of foreign policy continuously. Maybe there are some gaps here and there, but can't think of anything terribly significant at the moment. So this has always been seen as a power by American presidents, American administrations, and Congresses to work their will. You take it away, you've gutted the government of an awful lot of power, given the lessons of history. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's a bad thing. It's too bad people accept it, and we need to work to change it. But the Cuban issue should be, the Cuban example should be a very clear example to the American people about the futility of such things, and worse than futility, because it doesn't bring about the change the policymakers want, but it brings about an awful lot of misery. It also gives the regime in the targeted country a convenient thing to blame for the economic problems. So instead of people being able to blame the Castro regime, it was easier to believe that the big bad United States, just 90 miles away, was blocking trade and blocking visitations. And to that extent, it was true. Castro's system, I suspect, would have fallen of its own accord if it had been left alone. But he probably is able to buy some time by being able to blame the United States. And this is also what Hugo Chavez was able to do, and leaders have been able to do this constantly all over the world. Blame America, and since America is not non-interventionist, its fingerprints were usually somewhere near the scene of the crime. So it was not completely unjustified in blaming America.
That is a fantastic point. And when I visited Cuba many years ago, I was talking to a guy about that, and he said, if there had never been an embargo, or if the embargo had been lifted, it would have placed Castro in a very, very difficult position, because he he would know that Americans flooding onto the island would be a very big threat to his regime, bringing money, transacting business, bringing ideas, bringing books, and that in all likelihood, this guy told me, he says, Castro himself would have put trade restrictions on to prohibit Americans from coming in, knowing the dangers to his regime. He didn't have to do that. That the U.S. has done the dirty work for him, and as you point out, he's now got the excuse for the failures of his socialist system. You can say, oh, the reason there's so much poverty, so much misery, people verging on starvation is the embargo. And that's exactly what he does, what he calls the blockade. And then you've got this horrible conundrum of where the U.S. government is using communist methods to fight communism. I mean, shouldn't we be using our heritage to fight communism, free markets, economic liberty, the right of people to associate, travel, trade? I mean, it seems to me like that's a much better message with respect to fighting communism and statism and socialism than it is by adopting the principles of your opponent. And you know, your point is about, you know, governments have always done this, including the U.S. government. And I wrote in a blog today that, you know, it's incumbent, I think, on Americans to raise our vision to a higher level here. I mean, we've seen the massive failures of sanctions. We've seen the massive failures of the drug war, the welfare state, the warfare state, invasions, occupations, interventionism. And Americans are still mired down in this reform game. Well, how can we reform the government? You know, should we have Obamacare or not? And maybe we ought to loosen the sanctions here, or tighten them up over here. And maybe we need to intervene in this country, but not that country. I say let's raise our vision to a higher level. I mean, this is how mankind progresses, you know, with things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and due process of law. Let's raise our vision. This is where the American people, the private sector, can lead the world by saying, look, we're going to be the first country in history where we're going to prohibit, maybe with a constitutional amendment, our government from employing sanctions, from employing economic warfare. We're going to show the world what a genuinely free society is. And we start with this idea of you're not going to interfere with our trade restrictions. This is our right as Americans, our fundamental God-given rights as human beings to travel where we want, trade with whomever we want. And we're going to put a prohibition on the government from imposing sanctions on anybody else. I mean, what a great way to lead the world to freedom, but by just simply starting out with that prohibition on government conduct. And if people can stop government from interfering with religion, why can't we stop government interfering with our trade decisions, Sheldon?
Well, I think before they even are willing to think about that, they're going to have to rethink the nature of the state. I don't think you can start with, hey, the government should not be allowed to regulate our trade, individuals' trade, even with foreign countries, because now you're removing a huge tool of foreign policy, which we've already acknowledged goes back through American history. And why would people buy that unless they've already rethought the very nature of government? I mean, it seems to me they're not going to eviscerate the government until they radically rethink what the proper relationship is between this thing we call the government and themselves. So I don't say you can start with that. I think you got to go to a lower level. And then they conclude, oh, right, given now what I now think about government, it should not have this power. And I'm not sure you can do it starting with trade as an issue, because trade does relate to foreign affairs when you have Americans trading with people in foreign countries.
Yeah, well, it comes back to people asking fundamental questions here. Instead of getting mired down in how to reform this government program and how to reform that government program, you know, public schooling, vouchers, et cetera, you know, a failed government program after 100 years or more, the drug war. I mean, this thing's going on for decades, and all they keep trying to do is come up with more reforms, sanctions, foreign interventionism. I think you're right. I think it's time for Americans to ask some fundamental questions. What is the role of freedom? I mean, what is the meaning of freedom? What does it mean to be a free person? Does it just mean having freedom of speech? Does it mean just not being in jail? Or does it involve something more? Does freedom involve a much more all-encompassing thing that deals with economic rights and the ability to keep what you earn and decide for yourself what to do with it instead of being forced to share with others? What is the role of government in a free society? Does it have any role at all? If so, what should that role be? And I think that until we start addressing these fundamental questions, people are going to remain mired in this statism, this muck of statism in which we're mired in. But we have an opportunity. I get emails from people saying, well, how can you be optimistic when things are so bad? Well, because I recognize the power of ideas. Ideas can shift society. That's how we got these great concepts of habeas corpus and due process of law and freedom of religion and so forth, because people were willing to break out of the muck and raise their vision to a higher level. And I think that's what needs to be done now.
Agreed, and I agree. The battleground is ideas. It's bad ideas that most people absorb from a very young age, parents, schools, other family, friends, the media, and ideas such as Rousseau's ideas about the social contract, about the general will, about how the government is really does represent us in some important way. And so therefore, when we all cast our vote, the sort of consensus that arises out of that is the general will, therefore is the thing to do. People who most of whom never read Rousseau, end up being Rousseauians and operate with that in their background, in the back of their minds. So they don't see the government as something external to them, as something being imposed on them. In some deep way, it is them. And the politicians, of course, play on that. They talk about that. Obama certainly has. We're the government. The government is us. And the representatives they call themselves our representatives. And so that's reinforced from every angle, every direction. And that's why our job is so important, because we're really attempting to not only persuade people of the libertarian soundness of the libertarian ideas, but to make them question ideas they don't even know they hold. That's the tough part. They don't know they're holding Rousseau's philosophy. Even Locke is culpable here, because Locke told the story about a social contract as if we're all under the big tree and we all signed this thing. That's the story people have absorbed, and yet they're not really sure they do that. They couldn't write you a small essay on what that's all about. And so we have to talk them out of ideas they don't even know they hold.
Right, and it's no different from what people were debating in 1787 and during the time of the Articles of Confederation and the time during the time when the Constitution was being debated. These were ordinary people that were debating and discussing grand and glorious ideals and ideas. And there's absolutely no reason why Americans of our time shouldn't be doing the same. And that's, of course, what the Future of Freedom Foundation is trying to engender and bring about a discussion of these types of ideas and ideals and principles. On that note, Sheldon, we're out of time. Enjoy the conversation, and this is the Libertarian Angle. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.